All right, so this is just a sample test that is like a sample Blackboard test that you may or may not see in just want to close out some things that you may or may not see associated with your test. So I created this, you know, when it has really nothing to do with any particular campus. But you're going to see it. It's going to look very similar to this. Now, one of the things, and I put as a, I think I did say to indicate units, but I think sometimes it'll tell you not to indicate units. I can't remember if I changed that. So just pay attention. So since the answer says to indicate units, go ahead and indicate units for this particular example, but pay attention to what it asks you to do, because that will be dependent on the instructions. So I know at Allegheny campus, they just want you to write the numbers. So I do believe, since I created this, I just can't remember, since it does say to indicate the units. But anyways, so for this one, I'm just going to go through, remember, when we do 170 pounds to kilograms, you're dividing by 2.2. So I'm going to take my calculator. I'm going to take 117 divided by 2.2. And I'm going to get, if I can get my calculator ready. 117 divided by 2.2 gives me 53.181818 repeating. So we're going to round that to the nearest number, or the nearest tenth. So this would be 53.2 kilograms. I'm going to do the same thing here. 182 pounds divided by 282 or 2.2. And I'm going to get this time 82.7272 repeating. So I'm going to round that to 82.7 kilograms. Milliliters to ounces. I'm going to do this. And you might even notice as I'm going through this, it'll auto save these answers as we're going through. So if you forget to save, but I think at the very end, you can hit like save all answers, save and submit. That way, when you're taking this, just know to double check that you've had all your things saved. But if you put a value there, it should save it. So you should remember that 1 ounce is the same thing as 30 milliliters. So I'm going to take 200 divided by 30, and I'm going to get 6.6666666. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to round to the nearest tenth for this. Okay. So I'm going to get 6.7 ounces for that. Micrograms to milligrams. So when we go from micrograms to milligrams, we're going to move our decimal point over to the left, or if it's been a little while since you've looked at doing some of these things, I'm actually going to minimize this so I can, there we go. It doesn't look minimized to you, but it is to me. I'm going to see if I can pull up my annotation here. So for the 250 micrograms, I'm going to come down here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a conversion. I'm going to take my 250 micrograms. Okay, never mind. I'm not going to be able to show like what I want to show on here with this. So I'm not even going to try because it just keeps switching to different things. So there's limitations to technology. So what I'm going to do is, me personally, I'm just going to answer this as 0.25. Oops, that's 0.25. Make sure you have that leading 0 there. Do not put a lagging 0. Okay. I had some students taking the Allegheny County or the CCAC Allegheny practice test, and they were missing some of the questions and the feedback. They weren't really getting any feedback. And I told them, I was like, well, you've probably forgot your leading 0. So make sure you have that. That's a significant number that you need to have in there. The way I solve this is, like I said, I just move the decimal point over 3 places, or you could take 250 micrograms divided by 1,000 milligrams. Now this one, these start to get a little bit more straightforward because we know that 1 teaspoon is 5 milliliters. Okay, so I'm just going to take 30 divided by 5, and then my answer would just be the 6 teaspoons. I'm going to do the same thing I did when I went from micrograms to milligrams. I'm going to move my decimal point over 3 places. Alternatively, you can take 350 ml divided by 1,000 ml, and that'll give you 0.35 liters. Remember your leading zero. All right. I'm going to convert milligrams to grams. I'm going to do the same thing. I know that there's 1,000 milligrams in 1 gram. So I'm going to divide by 1,000 and I'm going to get 1.5 grams. All right, so this next one requires a little bit of work, right? Because we have a couple of things, and what we're going to do is, and this is where it's important, because it just says total fluid intake. What is this going to be? Well, total fluid intake is going to be looking at milliliters, okay? So that's why it's important to make sure you have your units assigned. So a glass, we can see, is 8 ounces. 8 ounces is 240 milliliters. Sandwich, not liquid. Gelatin dessert, so 2.5 times 30 would be that many ounces. So that would be 2.5 times 30 is 75. So 240 plus 75, and then a half pint. You need to make sure you know that one pint is equal to 2 cups. So a half pint is 1 cup, which is 240 ounces, or 240 milliliters, which is 8 ounces. So it's 75 plus 240 plus 240. So our answer should be, and I think this was even this sample question that I gave, should be 555 milliliters. Again, I would normally be drawing these out for you, so I apologize that I am not doing that. But as long as you're following me, and if you have any questions, just stop me and I can make sure I give you appropriate feedback. Yeah, so all I did was, so I know that 1 pint is 2 cups. So half a pint would be 1 cup. That's all I did. So I didn't even do anything with the half. I just said, okay, if 1 pint I know is equal to 2 cups, right, which is 480 milliliters, and 16 ounces. So a half a pint is the same thing as 1 cup. 1 cup is 8 ounces, which is 240 milliliters. So that's all I did. I didn't even do any kind of necessarily math. I just went with the factors I'm already supposed to know as far as pint, cups. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is a question. I doubt you'll see this type of question on your test, mainly because this is something that they see at Allegheny campus, which is called a fluid replacement question. And honestly, I don't even know that they see that. I think it's just a bad question that I put together a long time ago. But I'm going to just show you how you would solve this. And again, I'm mainly showing this to you just for just to kind of help you rationalize through answering a question like this. But keep in mind, you're not going to see this question on your test. So it says for every 100 milliliters of urine output, so I have 100 milliliters here, I'm going to replace with 50 milliliters of water. And then it says if the urine output over the last 4 hours is 750 milliliters, what would my fluid replacement volume be? So there's a couple of ways to do this. So what you need to realize is that for every 100 lost, you're going to replace with 50. And now I'm saying we lost 750. So there's 2 ways to do this. You can set up what's called like a ratio proportion setup, where you can take, you could take one output over the other, and then set them equal to your replacement volumes. So this would be the 50 because they're equivalent. And then this would be the unknown. So I'm just going to say X. I know nursing students hate that unknown X variable. Okay. But when I do that, that actually allows me to do something that a lot of nursing students try to do with regular multiplication problems is they try and do cross multiplication. So this would be one way to kind of set up a problem like this. The alternative way is if you think about, you know, the difference, like, so to go from 100 to 750, you know, what do I multiply 100 by to get to 750? So if I take 750 divided by 100, that is a multiple of 7.5. So I'm just going to write times 7.5. That number is the same number I'm going to multiply 50 by to get to my replacement volume. So if my original volume was the replacement volume was 50, now my change would be that 7.5. So I'm going to take 7.5 times 50. And so I'm actually going to have a replacement volume here of 375 milliliters. So, and then that's what I would put as my answer. I would put 375 milliliters. Now, again, you're not going to see this question on your test. This is just something that I created as a practice, just to kind of practice, like, you know, fluid replacement volumes. I think what you're going to ultimately see is the question I did previously, which is the how much total fluid intake, and then just calculating that for a patient. Okay, yes, I agree with you. Yeah, I would say for the most part, you're right. The second way typically works. The only time it can throw you off is if you actually have a lower number. So, like, let's say 100 milliliters is the expected output, but the patient only voids 75. We're still going to do a replacement volume. You just got to remember that you're still going to be calculating the same way. You're going to take the final output 75 divided by 100. I don't think you're going to see, like I said, a question like that. So I won't do that too much. So, all right. So the first question here, there is no indication, or there's no label here, but they give you all the information you need to solve this. They tell you to order 40. They tell you what's available 20. Then it says how much medication will the patient receive in one dose, and then to mark the cup. Okay. So really this question is about marking the cup more so than it is about, or I mean, obviously you have to do the calculation to get it, or you can just rationalize through it. If 20 is 15 ml, then you know 40 is going to be 30. So you're going to put a mark here at the 30. So you might get that where it'll tell you, and you should be able to see that little indicator that's there on the image, a drop point indicating that that is 30 ml. And if you make a mistake, you can always clear the coordinate and then you can put it where you want it to be. Depending on how it's coded or keyed, this might be a big box, like right on the line. It might be on each of the numbers. So I don't really know. That might even be a question to ask, like where do they exactly want you to mark on the cup, if they ask you to do any cup marking. Here's another cup question. It says our order is 0.375 grams by mouth every 6 hours. We have a suspension available, 125 milligrams per 5 ml. So the first thing you need to recognize is that you have grams and you have milligrams, and they both need to be the same units before you do any kind of math. So what I would do is I would take that 0.375 grams, convert it to milligrams, so 375 milligrams. And then if I'm doing ordered over half, which is a good method for this, I would take the 375, the order, over my available of 125. And then you're going to get 3, but you got to make sure you multiply by the quantity, which is 5. So you would drop a point at 15 ml. you've seen this question, the sliding scale question. I think we all know and realize this is not technically a math question. So, but it's here. So we'll take it. And it says, how many units of insulin will you administer if the patient's blood glucose level is 230? You're just going to look at the sliding scale and you're going to look for where 230 falls. It falls in the 4-unit range. So I'm going to write 4 units. Remember, because it said to put your units in your answer. So just to be on the safe side. All right. Now we have something with a label. Tagamet, 400 milligrams. It looks like they're tablets because it says 120 tablets. The order is cimetidine, and cimetidine is the generic name for Tagamet. Tagamet's the brand name. 0.8 grams by mouth daily. So what's my order? 0.8 grams. But the availables in milligrams. So I need to convert 0.8 grams to milligrams. 0.8 becomes 800 milligrams, 400 milligrams. So we're going to have 2 tablets.
I have a question, Dr. Red.
Go ahead.
Do you know if there will be any like scored tablets on there on the exam?
You should always assume that yes, there will be, but I have no idea if there will be. Anytime they give you tablets, that means you can give a half a tab. So you could have an answer of like 2.5 or 1.5 or even 0.5. Just know that tablets can be scored. And if you end up getting a half answer, it probably means that it is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good question. All right, so here's one, and this is, again, a coordinates question, okay? So this is asking about heparin, okay? It gives us an order of 2,500 units, and we can see that the available is 5,000 units. We don't really need to guess what the units are going to be. It's in milliliters. The syringe is in milliliters. The only thing I need to know is where to drop my point. Now, here's where it gets kind of fun. So we're going to take the 2,500 and we're going to divide by, because that's my order. My available is 5,000. And I'm going to get an answer of 0.5. Now, you're going to see that your syringe is 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8. So we need to find 0.5. And I think we can safely assume that the 0.5 is going to be right there at the in between the 0.4 and the 0.6. And you can always double check that, because if this is 0.4, this should be 0.45, 0.5, 0.55, 0.6. So that should still work out as far as that. I think you've had probably enough practice looking at some of those things now that you've been practicing this a little bit. But that's how that's where I would drop that that point. All right, so morphine, they try and trick you here, right? They say it's 10 milligrams per 10 milliliters, and then in parentheses, they reduce it. It's 1 milligram per 1 milliliter, so it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your order, 5 milligrams. You're going to put that over your available 1 times your milliliters, volume 1. So the answer for this would just be 5 ml. You hope for questions like that, right? Pretty straightforward. Oral suspension. Anytime you hear oral suspension, you have to assume that it's liquid. If it's liquid, you know that it's going to be administered in milliliters. So the order is 150,000 units. And our available is 100,000 units per milliliter. So I'm going to take my 150,000 divided by 100,000. And I'm going to get an answer for this of 1.5 ml. So I will say that this probably is not an appropriate like amount, because I think last time we met, someone asked me, like, are these even realistic? Like, I would say this is not realistic. The realistic number might be 1.5 million units of oral swish, and then giving them 15 milliliters seems like something that they would actually notice is in their mouth, as opposed to like literally less than probably the amount of saliva that's in your mouth right now in that 1.5 mil. Okay, think this is less than a teaspoon, right? It's less than half of a teaspoon, so it's small. quarter teaspoon, almost, or a little bit more than a quarter teaspoon. Here, if that was Brianna that asked about the scored tablets, here's the volume. The order is 2.5 milligrams. You have 5 milligram tablets. So you're going to assume that it is, the tablets are scored, right? So that way you can give them a half of a tablet. Now you want to pay attention, and sometimes you'll have I do believe that the 0.5 is the correct way to write these. I have seen over the years where some instructors prefer the 1/2, like the half denotion, but I also think that can get confused with like 12 or 1 or 2. So I think the 0.5 is the preferred way that they want you to write that down, but you can always just confirm that with your instructor before you take your test. Annoy them with questions. I'm sure they'll appreciate it. All right. Here is morphine, 45 milligrams IV. So IV already tells you intravenous. It's going to be a liquid. So if you didn't know anything else, how much medication will the patient receive in one dose? So it tells us 250 milligrams, and then it says 25 milligrams per milliliter. We're going to use the 25 milligrams per milliliter for solving the math associated with this question. So I'm going to take my order of 45. I'm going to divide by 25. And I'm going to get an answer of 1.8 milliliters. Now, the reason we don't use the 250 is because this is technically, I believe, possibly a suspension type question, but it also tells you each milliliter contains 25 milligrams. So it reiterates, and I think the whole vial or the whole bottle, 10 milliliters is 250 milligrams. So sometimes you're going to see these labels that have some extra information on there. I told you from the get out, we're looking for milliliters because it's an IV medication. If it's IV medication, you know it's liquid, you know it's milliliters. So you're looking for that milligrams per milliliter concentration or strength. And so that's why you look at that as opposed to the 250 milligrams. If they give you the reduced number, so on this example, there is no reduced number because all they say is 250 milligrams. They don't tell you that it's 250 milligrams per 10 ml. But in that previous problem, so let me go back up right here. This morphine was 10 milligrams per 10 milliliters. Then you want to use the 1 milligram per milliliter, use the reduced fraction. But whichever one you use, you're going to get the same answer. So it doesn't matter necessarily. Just don't do 10 and then 1, because then you'll be in trouble. Okay. Just make sure if you're going to use 10 over 10, great. If you're going to use 1 over 1, great. All right. Here's a dilantin question. 250 milligrams by mouth. So by mouth could be a tablet, a capsule, or could be liquid. Then it says how many teaspoons will you give if it is labeled as shown below. Now, one of the things you need to remember is that 1 teaspoon is equal to what? 5 milliliters, right? So another way to represent 125 milligrams per 5 ml is just to say the same thing, is that it is equivalent to 125 milligrams per teaspoon. Okay, so it means the same thing. So since I know that 5 ml is 1 teaspoon, I can use those interchangeably, not a big deal. So I'm going to take my order, 250 milligrams, divide by my available, 125, times my quantity, which is 1 teaspoon. So I'm going to give this patient 2 teaspoons. Now, keep in mind, this is being recorded. So if you miss some of these things, or if you're like, oh, I deleted the writing too quickly, just know you can always go back to the recording and pause, if you need to see what I wrote down, if I'm going too fast. I don't think I'm going too fast. Okay. Then you have V-Cillin K suspension, 150 milligrams orally. Okay. But it's a suspension. So the fact that it's a suspension tells you that it's liquid. Okay. Then we look at our label. Now our label has some information here that might seem conflicting. So you have 125 milligrams, but then it also says 200,000 units, and then it says per 5 ml. So here's the way you kind of work around that. Since the order is in milligrams, you're going to use the milligrams information. If the order was in units, you would use the units information. So this is just another representation of the same thing that the 125 milligrams is stating. So if you're solving this, you're going to take your order of 150 over the available of 125 times your quantity of 5 milliliters. Okay. So that's supposed to be a 150 at the top. I apologize for that terrible writing. 150 divided by 125 times 5 will give you an answer of 6 milliliters. All right. Here's another question where you're going to mark the syringe. This one might be a little bit harder to see because, or at least it looks harder to see on my screen. So the order is 75 milligrams Demerol intramuscular. Intramuscular tells you it's liquid, so you know that you're looking for milliliters. Also, the syringe is indicated, or the Tubex is indicated in milliliters here as well. So you know that it's milliliters is what you're looking for. Or that's supposed to say pre-filled syringe, not a refilled syringe. That would not be. Please don't use refilled syringes. Okay. Even if you don't like the person you're working with, don't use refilled syringes. All right. So my order is 75. My available is 50 milligrams per milliliter. So I'm going to take 75 divided by 50 times 1, and I get 1.5. So I'm just going to drop my marker on the 1.5 milliliters. All right. Digoxin, 0.75 milligrams. You have the following on hand. You could see that it's in that these are tablets. And you could see again that there's two numbers there, 125 micrograms and 0.125 milligrams. So the same rule that kind of tip that I gave you previously about the milligram units medication above or previously. If I'm looking at micrograms, or if the order's in micrograms, I'm going to look at micrograms. If the order's in milligrams, which it is, that's the number I'm going to use. Those are not two different strengths. They're the same strength. Okay. So I'm going to take 0.75. I'm going to divide by 0.125. And I'm going to get 6 tablets, which may not be an appropriate number of tablets. It might be too many, but that's what it is. And then just as a reminder, make sure you read the directions of your test. If it's a Blackboard test, sometimes they'll tell you just to give the numerical answer. In the directions that I created, I indicated that I wanted the units to be written, and I gave an example, and I showed number, space, and then the units. I also know that if I were grading this and asking for that, I would go back and double check to see, like, if you missed something because you didn't capitalize the L or something like that in milliliters, I would double check and see where and give you credit where credit was due. All right. 500 milligrams by mouth, BID. Okay. And we have an order of it didn't even give us to tell us the order. So we're hoping that it's the cephalexin. And it's just how many capsules. Okay. So 250 milligrams per capsule, 500 milligrams is the order. We're just going to say, put an answer there of 2 capsules. Now I'm realizing it looks like this test is actually missing the reconstitution questions. I was wondering, I couldn't remember if I had that on here or not. But we did go through that quite a few times. So they are previously recorded. And I can always pull up another example if need be, just to kind of go through that one more time. Just remind me. This right here is just saying patients receive 10 units of regular insulin, 20 units of NPH. So they're asking you to add 2 numbers together. So 10 plus 20 is 30. Mark the correct syringe indicating the total insulin level to be administered. So it should be at the 30. So I'm going to drop a point here at the 30 units. Now you might be wondering, well, how do I decide which one do I use? With insulin is delivered and administered in syringes that have units as the indication of administration. So you wouldn't need to convert units of insulin to milliliters of insulin, although you could if you had the label, but notice there's no label here. So they're trying not to confuse you. Even if they gave you the label, if there's a unit syringe, that's what you should be using for insulin. That might be different for other things like heparin or other things that are measured in units. But for insulin has unit specific syringes. All right. And then the last question here, Aldamet, 125 milligrams. You have Aldamet available as an oral suspension, 250 milligrams per 5 ml. So I'm going to take my order, 125, divided by the 250, and I'm going to multiply by my quantity of 5, and my answer would be 2.5 ml. Then if you're doing this on Blackboard, make sure you save all your answers. If it's like, you should have plenty of time. Like it's only been 30 minutes since I started this, and I've answered all these questions. So you should have plenty of time to review your answers. That's assuming that it's set up like this. If it's set up one at a time and no backtracking, then you may not have that option. But just realize that it's 25 questions. You have more time than you think, okay? You have lots of time to go through. The very first few questions, like the basic conversion questions, you're going to run through those real quickly, right? Converting micrograms to milligrams, milligrams to grams. You're going to run through those pretty quickly, but don't go through them so fast that you make a silly mistake. Okay. So double check your answers before you move on, do the moving the decimal method, put it in your calculator, just double check your answers before you move on in the event that it's, showing you the questions one at a time. Take your time, use your scratch paper if they give it to you, and answer the questions to the best of your ability. And then when you're all said and done, save and submit, and then you'll get some feedback. So I actually that was 44 minutes that I took, but I actually opened this up before I started recording. So, but even through that, it was turned on. So you can see I started at 5:20. I didn't even start the review session. I didn't even start talking to Brianna until 5:30. So, but anyways, so this is not going to give me feedback.
I have a question really quickly, Dr. Red.
Okay.
Now, is there a way for us to tell when we know that when the answer could be possibly wrong before we even submit the test, or before we even move on to the next question? Is there like a way for us to be able to tell if the answer is wrong?
So probably the best way to answer that question would be to say, what you can do is, if you do it, let's say I'm just doing like a conversion question. If I did it 2 ways and I get the same answer both ways, I'm going to feel pretty comfortable that I answered it correctly. However, if I do it 2 ways and I get 2 different answers, I'm going to have to figure out what the problem is with that. I would say that if you've been practicing these and you've been getting the right answers consistently, your whatever strategy you're using is most likely working very well for you. And so you just trust that you're getting the right answer if you're only doing it like one way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So the best way to get feedback is by doing some of these practice problems, and then at the end of doing the practice problems, you'll notice that at the end of doing some of these practice problems, you'll know that if you're missing one consistently, then you're like, okay, what is my strategy here? Why do I keep missing this? That's usually where like I try and fill in that gap, and I try and help you out if you know that already. But if you're getting everything right, just trust that you are doing the math right, and just be patient and take your time going through the test. All right. Are there any other questions? I know I've given you a number of reviews over the last couple of weeks. Hopefully you've dove into the YouTube content just to kind of get some see what some of these questions are going to look like, and then how to solve some of these questions. I would say the one that really trips people up is the reconstitution question. And now I think most, if not all of you, know how to look at that and figure out where to get the information to answer those types of questions. Do one, are you talking about a reconstitution? Okay, sure. So let me pull one up here. Give me just one moment. So let me see if I can give you one that you haven't seen before. Or at least potentially haven't seen before. Oh, these are just extra problems. Nope, that's not it. All right, just give me one moment. I'm gonna find an example here that you really haven't seen yet. This is actually from, if you go into the 230 folder, it's a practice problem, but there's things on the 230 practice that you don't need to worry about yet. So I wouldn't recommend going into that and trying to answer all those questions. But if you want to look at the example of the reconstitution question, this is where I'm getting it from. But you've also already seen the example I'm going to show you. So let me pull this up here and share it. All right. And then I saw someone has a question on intake. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I was wondering if when the question has like custard, is that like, is it like considered like, you know, is it added on to like the fluid when we're calculating intake?
So there's some nuances with that I'm not 100% sure, because here's the way I look at it. I know like pudding is very little liquid and it's more powder when you're making it, whereas Jello is more liquid than powder. So Jello is considered a liquid, whereas pudding is considered a solid. I don't know about custard. There should be a list of things that you should know would be calculating liquid versus not calculating it because it's not a liquid. Unfortunately, I don't know that off the top of my head. I haven't seen any examples of that where like I haven't seen where you have to calculate, like you have a cup of water and ice and then calculating the ice I think the way that they're going to trick you is they might say pudding and Jello. And then you need to know to calculate the Jello volume, but not the pudding volume. So I don't know about custard. I'm sorry. I do not know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There must be a list or something somewhere just so that way you know what to do as far as that's concerned. The other thing, and I've mentioned this and I have yet to see this as an example, but they could try and trick you by saying like, oh, the patient had like a 6-ounce piece of turkey breast. Well, that's 6 ounces by weight, not by volume. So don't convert that to milliliters. Okay. All right. So for this is an example of a reconstitution question. You've actually seen this medication, you've seen this label, so it's a similar label. When we are looking at this, a couple things to pay attention to, because the questions won't necessarily look like this. This was a photocopy from like a textbook or something. But you will see some similar aspects. You'll see an order. Okay. You'll see the available. Now, a couple things that you'll know that you're dealing with a reconstitution because of two things. It'll tell you it's intramuscular. Okay. Which tells you that you're looking for milliliters, because remember, injectables, IV, IM, SC, oral suspensions, those are all going to be milliliters unless they specifically say they want it in something other than milliliters, like teaspoons or something like that. But I doubt they're going to say that. So that can be anything, right? When we look at our label, what tells me we're dealing with a reconstitution question is that the main part of the label will say 500 milligrams, but it won't say anything about the milliliters. And so that's your clue that you're dealing with a reconstitution. Also, sometimes on the label, it says before reconstitution, right? So it tells you it's a reconstitution. But if it's a reconstitution question, that's your clue that you need to look at the label. Okay. We have to read the label and we have to look and see what information is listed there. So it'll say things like the usual adult dosage, 250 milligrams to 1 gram. The order is 0.375 grams, so it's within the normal range. Then it says for intramuscular administration, which is what we're doing, we're going to add 2 milliliters of water, sterile water, shake it up, and then you're going to withdraw the entire contents. The total volume after you add 2 milliliters of water is going to be 2.2 milliliters. So those are all good and well to know about the volumes added, but the information we're looking for is right here. 225 milligrams per milliliter is your available and what you're looking for in all of that. You can ignore the 2 milliliters. You can ignore the 2.2 milliliters. That the 2.2 milliliters is the more important number because it tells you the total volume. So I always tell students, if you got a label, or if you had a label and it didn't tell you the concentration after mixing, which I've yet to see that, but if it didn't tell you that, you would take that 500 milligrams divided by 2.2 milliliters, and that would give you your approximate concentration. So like if I take 500 divided by 2.2, I'm going to get 227.3. So you could just round that to 227 milligrams per milliliter. So your answers aren't going to be too far off as far as that's concerned. But the number you want to use for this is the 225 milligrams per milliliter because it's very explicit on the label to use that number. Okay. So I'm just going to solve this using, you can do dimensional analysis. You can do order over half. So I'm converting grams to milligrams over my 225 milligrams times my ml. So 375 divided by 225 gives me an answer of 1.6 repeating. So my answer for this question would be 1.7 milliliters. What are you going to see in your test? You're going to see a label that looks very similar to this, and you're going to see varying degrees or varying changes in the order. So it might be 0.3 0.25 milligrams, it might, or 0.25 grams, or it might be 280 milligrams. You're going to see any variety of things that would constitute a reconstitution type question. The trick to the reconstitution is just knowing that that's what it is and how to look and dissect the label. If you go into the folder that I created on the Microsoft OneDrive, there's a folder there that just says Reconstitution RX, which is just a bunch of different labels. You can look at those labels and see what these different types of reconstitution labels look like, or you yourself could go and just Google reconstitution labels and see what's there. So go ahead, Brianna.
I'm not sure if they will put on there like how ATI says round to the nearest whole number. If we have this kind of question, we have to round to like the whole number or something. How will we know when to do that?
So, well, first of all, the only time you're really going to round to a whole number is like, first of all, if like you get like 1.99999, your answer is 2. Okay. According to the blueprint, if you have a number greater than 1, round to the nearest 10th. If you have a number less than 1, round to the nearest 100th. And that's usually more so for milliliter measurements, because you'll have a syringe that potentially could go down, and some syringes can measure down into the 1000th place. So that's ultimately what determines what that is. But the rule is, if it's a number greater than 1, so like here, 1.7 or 1.6666666 milliliters, round to the nearest 10th, 1.7 milliliters. So they're not going to tell you individual directions, but if they do, then you just follow those directions. But I don't think that they're going to ask that. And then if you get something like you're doing like a capsules or a tablets or something like that, it should end at the appropriate number. So it should end at 2 tablets, 4 capsules, 1.5 tablets, because we can assume tablets are scored and can be cut in half. So. Okay. Oh yeah. And then, no, like what I mentioned before, to answer your question, I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong, Jaspona, but, the, ABC, this is just taken from a textbook. I'm assuming I didn't even, have this. You're going to see it, basically, it will, a lot of times there'll be a syringe associated with this, but like this won't be, that won't be there. So there'll probably be how many milliliters or how much will you administer is probably what it'll say. So how much will you administer? So that last question, and then there'll probably be a picture of a syringe, and then it'll tell you to mark the syringe. But no, it won't say ABC. The ABC is just helpful for you. So if you're going back and reviewing this, how many milliliters of diluent will you add? Okay, it says to add 2 milliliters of diluent. What is the dosage strength? That's what ultimately what you're looking for, is that 225 milligrams per milliliter, and then you can solve. So it's just a stepwise way to answer this question, but no, it won't look like this. Yep, you're welcome. All right, are there any other questions, comments, concerns? All right. Well, if there's no other questions, just know that if you do have any questions between now and your test next week, you can email me. If you have a question, I'll try and answer it. I should be available tomorrow, and then through the weekend. I think your test is the Monday or Tuesday. But I will put down my email here if you don't already have it. And you're welcome to email me if you do have a question. And like I said, I will post this up on YouTube later today or tomorrow, and that way you can review it. Again, if you need to, you can see the examples I gave. And the best thing you can do is just practice, get your hands on as many problems as you can. Keep in mind that the ATI is a good sampling of math, but what I've gone over with you guys is a good example of what you'll see on your test. So if what I've seen shown you looks a little bit like more easy and straightforward than sometimes the ATI is, that's mainly because ATI covers some things that you're not responsible for yet on this blueprint. You will be for second, third, fourth semester, but just letting you know why there's some discrepancy there. So all right, well, let's see here. Yeah. Oh, okay. So yes, I will post this up on YouTube either later tonight or tomorrow. It'll be up and available.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. All right, and good luck on your test. If I don't hear from you, I suspect you'll do very well.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.